There's a lot of things I like about today's gospel passage. My favorite thing we're actually not going to talk about on the sermon. It didn't end up going that way. My favorite part of this little story is when Jesus is explaining how Moses gave divorce to the people because they needed it because of sin in the world and the hardness of their hearts, but it wasn't originally meant to be that way. And the disciples listened to him, and then they asked, well, then who should get married? Like, if I just can't divorce my wife and dismiss her whenever I want to, why would you get married? But we're not going to talk about that today. What I really liked about that story we saw there on the video was right at the end when Leo said, now we have a purpose, which is to know Christ and make Christ known. And when I first heard that, the question that popped into my mind was, what does marriage have to do with knowing Christ or making Christ known? And I think the key is in what Jesus said in our gospel reading for today. Haven't you read the scriptures? He said. They record that from the beginning, God made them male and female. And he said, this explains why a man leaves his father and mother and is joined to his wife, and the two become one. Since they are no longer two, but one, let no one split apart what God has joined together. At the very beginning, Jesus is saying, human beings were designed in a very specific way. We were not only created as two separate and distinct entities, male and female, but made in a way that those two could quite literally become one. And so what had been separate could be joined. And I think we should ask the obvious question, why in the world were we created this way? God could have created us any way he chose. Why this way? Well, if you consider that by the time we came on the scene, we've talked about how God's universe was already embroiled in a battle that had begun with Lucifer, the archangel in heaven. And if you consider that Lucifer's beef with God in heaven had been that he wanted to be God, he wanted to be a creator just like God, it seems reasonable to conclude that the issue of creation, and particularly God's creation, was on the minds of the angels and any other creatures God had made who were observing what was going on. In fact, in this war, God's own government and even his very nature had been called into question by this enemy. So there were lots of questions swirling around involving life, death, creation, and love. And one of the first things God did was create this planet and then create a race of people, a new type of creature who would, in many ways, be able to help God answer a lot of those questions. That's what we were made for, to be part of the solution. In the meantime, Adam and Eve decided to also make us part of the problem. But that's okay. God was already fixing the problem through what he was going to do with the human race, so I guess it was just sort of easy for us to be added to the list of beneficiaries. So that's why I think God created human beings in the very specific way he did. Because he was saying some very specific things and demonstrating some very specific things about the nature of love and creation. First of all, have you ever noticed that the way a man and woman physically become one is the only possible pairing of two bodies that preserves a face-to-face orientation? I tried to say that as non-graphically as possible. I didn't know when I so I was especially concerned about that. It's the only possible pairing of two bodies where face-to-face activity occurs. And you can't deny the primary relational component there. We are designed so that our physical intimacy does not get in the way of our relational intimacy. In God's design, dehumanization is virtually impossible. It's pretty hard to turn a person into some sort of sex object when their face is right up in your face. God's design for sex helps us focus on the other. It's not a self-centered thing. And in the gospel lesson, Jesus reiterates that God's main purpose for marriage from the very beginning was that the two should become one. Why is that important? Because maybe that kind of unity is hard for us to understand. And maybe we're not the only ones who find that difficult. As John said in the introduction this morning, we kind of still struggle with that. How can three be one? Is it one? Is it three? We struggle with that a bit. And perhaps when Satan raised questions about God's own nature, God was looking for a way to further explain that nature, which is unity within community. Right? Isn't that what it is? One God in three persons. We still call that a mystery. And we struggle, but don't we sometimes ask, as we have done today, how can God be three and one at the same time? And our minds grapple with that. But God has given us a vehicle for understanding within our own human experience how that could potentially happen. Because we routinely observe how two very separate people can grow and fuse together ever more closely over a lifetime together. How the two can very much become one. One in purpose, one in thought, one in mission, one in love, both physically and relationally. That, I believe, is just a reflection of the absolute oneness that has always existed among the Father, the Son, and the Spirit. That's how Jesus could tell his disciples in John chapter 14, verse 9, anyone who has seen me has seen the Father. That wasn't just some flowery sentiment or some poetic way of Jesus saying he was sent from heaven on a divine mission. He was articulating there the reality of God's nature, that there is such unity of purpose and mission and love among those three persons of the Godhead that even if the Father had come to earth instead of the Son, our record of history would be absolutely the same. The Father would have said the same words, done the same things, lived the same life, died the same death. So God created us specifically to mirror his own nature in this way, if we choose to enter the marriage state. That two previously separate people could and would become one flesh. And according to Jesus, no one may separate what God has joined together. Now, most of the Bible translations prefer to render this verse in a more prescriptive way. Let no one separate what God has joined together. But I wonder if Jesus didn't have in mind more of the idea of this translation, which makes it sound like it's sort of impossible to separate what has been joined together in such a manner. For instance, you can speak of joining links of a chain together, right? And if you do that, the links, they stay relatively individual, and they can easily be unlinked if necessary. But still, you could say those links are joined. But what about joining an egg white and a yolk. When you've whipped those two things up in a bowl with your fork, are you going to separate them again? No, you are not. I wonder if that's not what Jesus meant when he said, "No one may separate what God has joined together." Oh, yes, Moses gave you divorce because you're hard-hearted and sinful and we're living in this world that sometimes necessitates that. But does divorce actually fully separate you? Once you have become one flesh with another person in such a way, can you ever truly go back to who you were before you were joined? Perhaps that's why divorce has so many ramifications and unintended consequences, because in its essence, it is trying to accomplish something that maybe can't be fully accomplished. Now, don't misunderstand me. I am not saying that in this sinful world there are not circumstances and situations where divorce is necessary and perhaps even the best of all the bad options. There are a lot of people, I am sure, who have used our gospel lesson from today to beat a divorcee over the head. And that's not what I'm doing or intending to do. But I do want us to understand how marriage was designed to directly help us know Christ and make Christ known. Because what we experience within the realm of marriage is the opportunity to reach out and touch the mystery of God's very own nature. And where does creation come into that? Do you suppose it's any coincidence that the physical act of the two becoming one flesh, that act which expresses the height of physical and relational intimacy, is the same act that results in the creation of little people in our image? Is that an accident? It can't be. God doesn't do accidents. The word coincidence is not in his vocabulary. The creation of little people in our own image was designed to come straight out of the experience of love and unity between a man and a woman when those two become one flesh. And isn't God saying by this, isn't he conveying that his own motivation in creation is love? It is out of his own infinite love, his own unity in community that he creates. Because he wants more friends. He wants companionship. He wants to share every amazing secret of the universe with more people, more creatures, more angels. Isn't that why we have kids? Or at least part of the reason. I mean, I know that kids think parents have them only for free slave labor. I hear that a lot these days. And I can agree, that is an added bonus. But that's never the motivation. Free slave labor. I mean, first of all, let's admit there is nothing free about it. Kids are about the most expensive hobby you can have. But all I can remember when David and I decided to have a family, and when we were talking about that, was how wonderful it would be to share some of those things we loved most in life with some little people that we made. And it really has been wonderful. In fact, it was the whole trucking thing that has sort of curtailed what I think would have turned into a much bigger family if Dad wasn't gone much of the week, leaving me at home to deal with all of these free slaves. Because after Giovanna arrived, and I looked at Caroline, and then I looked at Giovanna, and then I realized that those two cakes were baked using the very same recipe. I was really curious to see what would come out if we tried again. But God knew what would be best for us. And we are living the best life with our slaves. I mean, our kids. There are a lot of families, though, where it isn't the best life, where the relationships are strained and there is not peace and joy and love in the family. We see that that has become part of the demonstration as well when sin entered the world. Through our marriages and our families, God points out that good family relations require the buy-in of all parties. Right? Mom and Dad can't just decree that everyone will love each other. Well, we make a lot of decrees when the kids are little, but eventually the kids grow up. And when they become adults, whether or not they're going to continue to speak to you or to come over for the holidays can't be determined by a decree. If you have tried to build love and trust and friendship over the years, then the relationship may be a lasting one. But if you haven't, and the trust has broken down somewhere, then the relationship can fall apart. No relationship is unilateral. Not spouse to spouse, not parent to child, not God to us. All parties must choose to buy in if there's going to be mutual love and trust and peace. And so God can even use our bad family relations at times to demonstrate the nature of these relationships. He is so amazing, isn't he? In his own nature, he exists in a divine community that's built on this mutual love, trust, and admiration. And out of this relationship of love comes the creation of quite literally everything. And then we are invited to participate in that oneness with him. And we're even invited to participate in such oneness with our spouse that we might also become little creators of people in our own image. It is in this way that marriage, I believe, was particularly designed to be a vehicle by which we can know Christ and make him known. We have the opportunity to become one because God himself is one. And that is a unity that not even sin could separate.